Hey guys,
What's going on?
nothing much. We were talking different backgrounds before. It's always an easy way to start it off. And Julian only got better with the sweatshirt. Yeah, strong. Um, but anyways, I gave really short intros there for both of you, and I would love for you all to do a better job of it. And so, Julian, if you're up for it, I'd love to get a little background on you and on and explanation of On Deck for
Sure.
those who aren't already familiar.
Yeah. So, what we do at On Deck, also known as ODF, is we help more people start the best companies. And there's really two parts to that. There's more people, and there's the best companies. We believe, maybe somewhat controversially, that there are too few good people starting companies right now. There are a lot of people who probably shouldn't be starting companies who are, but we believe that there are so many people who have yet to start a company who could make incredible founders and who should be doing it. And we think that the way that we can help more people start better companies is by helping them find the missing pieces, helping them figure out who their collaborators might be, what their initial products might be, who their initial customers might be, these sorts of things. And we describe these missing pieces as the things that we sort of like help coalesce through a program called ODF, which we are about to enter the 22nd cohort in. As you mentioned in your really lovely intro, we've had over 1,000 companies get started through that. And they've raised a lot of money, though I don't think that that's always indicative of success. It is a promising sign, and yeah, it's been really incredible. Again, like the upcoming cohort is going to be in just a couple months, so we can share more information about that. And then on my end personally, I've worked with hundreds of founders now, helping them think through not just fundraising, but specifically how to think about momentum in the early days. And fundraising is like one form of momentum, like raising money, but also getting momentum on product, which can then translate to customer momentum, which can then translate to actually ending up raising a great amount of money. So that's me in a nutshell. Have invested probably at this point about across On Deck funds, personal, probably about $50 million in companies over the last 5 years. And yeah, really excited to be here. And thank you so much for the invite.
Yeah, of course. No, and again, it's such a full circle moment for me personally to be talking about us with you, Julian, right? Because it was something, and I mentioned a little bit, but it was 2018. I was fundraising for OnePager.vc and got on a call with Julian, and we haven't spoken about this, but you were super helpful. I've talked to, and we'll talk about this as well. There are dicks who are investors. It happens. People are unnecessarily rude. People who ghost, people, whatever. And those are all the, people who just, it's all in the no category, but they all kind of hurt different amounts. And Julian ultimately didn't invest, but was very helpful in the way and very gracious kind of in the way that he did it. So again, thank you for that. Andrew, again, we've been on kind of weird parallel paths here, so I'm super excited to get your thoughts on all this stuff. But would love, the intro to TaxWire, obviously, which is the most important and exciting part of it, and then on your personal background.
Yeah, totally. No, this is fun. I know both of you. I've known both of you for a second now, so it's excited to do this. I guess I'll kind of like do the whole like background thing and bring that into TaxWire, what we're talking about today with fundraising, and try to double click on the things that I think will be helpful to other founders. My background, I basically have only ever done early stage startup stuff. Like I started a company that was like weird and raised a little bit of money when I was 20 with some folks that were older than me. That got me into doing startups. And then I've basically been in and out of that in some capacity ever since then. So I was at a venture fund for a little bit. So I had a brief run seeing it from like a VC perspective. And then I worked with Julian at On Deck back in the day. And then during that time, actually, I started writing like really, really tiny angel checks, like 1K here, like 1K there. And like the first two were literally in like just like friends companies. And then eventually that turned into like doing SPVs and all that kind of stuff, which is actually how I joined the startup I was at most recently, called Party Around back in the day, and more recently known as Capital. But originally we were building an SPV product, and I knew a lot about SPVs, and I'd run a lot of SPVs, and I knew a lot of other people running SPVs, and so that's how I originally ended up talking to them, and then later joining. And so yeah, like, and then so did kind of saw the investing stuff from like as a tiny angel, you're like not really you're not leading anybody's rounds. You kind of see like some of the real stuff. You end up helping founders fundraise a fair amount. So I got probably some of the most exposure of my career to fundraising in that period, which actually helped me a lot. It wasn't everything, but it helped a lot when I actually did go start my own thing and raise money. But anyway, to bring that full circle, Capital sold about a year ago, a little over a year ago. I was head of growth there. I left a little bit before the acquisition, and to start a company, to be honest, it was like 100% to start a company. It was not necessarily to start TaxWire. Like, so during that period, I did a brief head of, it was basically I was a fractional CFO for a company that I did invest in. And the founder was like, the company's like doing incredibly well. They actually just raised their Series A, and they're like, the growth is incredible. And the growth was incredible like this time last year. And so I was helping solve a bunch of like compliance issues that they had, which is why he needed a fractional seat, like someone just to do finance stuff basically until they could hire full time. And so I was like, sure, I have the time, I'll help you out. And basically one of the big things we had an issue with was figuring out how the heck we were supposed to collect sales tax across a bunch of different states, because we were growing really quickly. And that had put us on the radar of like, I think like Georgia, Texas, and some other places who were like telling us we should be collecting sales tax in these different jurisdictions. And so I tried to buy like some kind of piece of software to solve the problem for us, and we just ended up having a lot of problems in finding something that would do that. Spent like a bunch of money and time on it, and it's a longer story that I've actually got a blog post on. But basically, I got so frustrated with that I stopped working on what I have been working on, and ended up like 6 months later, after talking to a ton of customers, starting what is now TaxWire. And so we are still kind of being a little bit quiet, but we're working with around like a bunch of different SaaS and e-commerce companies. But basically anybody that operates and sells in a bunch of different places, like we want to make it dead simple for you to collect sales tax and file sales tax and just like not have to think about it. It's like one of those annoying things. It's like taxes, finance, you have to do it, but it's like not mission critical. And so ideally we want to just keep it that way. So and then so, and then we raised a pre-seed end of last year, which is kind of how we got talking about this.
Yeah, no, and again, and we talked about it before, where this is we've done different types of formats here, from the full kind of panel where there's, I'm just kind of passing the mic around, to the more one-on-one interview. And I think this is a cool in between where everyone here has interesting context, I think, in terms of like the platforms we've been a part of. But excited to dive in. And I think the first the first kind of annoying and easy question is and I thought about a funnier title for this, to raising money in 2024 as a not AI company, right? As anything besides it. And I think that, and that's not really the question as much as, what do you think, is there something specific about like the market today that comes to mind in terms of how fundraising is different? Or do you think that the things that we'll talk about here are more kind of like core truths, things that are just how fundraising should be done in a market, no matter what the market is, right? Because there's like the in 2024 aspect of the title, right? But does that, like, do you believe in like strategies changing?
I don't know about I think there's like definitely like a lot of timeless things. I think we'll personally, Julian, I'm sure will have his own take on this. I think we'll talk about a lot of things that are timeless, but I think some things definitely are like, my experience of it end of last year, and from even still seeing a lot of my friends raising, is it's definitely a lot harder than it was a few years ago to fundraise. It's still very doable. There's like people putting money out there, but minus a handful of companies where they just like have the easiest raise possible. It's like, it's not easy. So I think there's that side of it. And then I do think there are certain spaces that are just pretty out of favor. And so you're going to like, even we felt this, like we had a lot of investors that wanted us to make the AI tax compliance pitch. And so like you're going to feel, even if you're not doing a specifically AI thing, you're going to feel some pressure to make it an AI pitch. So.
Yeah. Julian, do you, I think that's a good kind of segue into some of the pitching questions, right? And of like, and I guess there's an underlying one there of, do you format your pitch? Like your pitch is obviously for investors, but it needs to be like what the company does, right? Like how much to mold what you're doing for storyline in compared to, and this is a pretty deep one to start with, but how much to mold your storyline for what investors want to hear compared to the cleanest way to articulate the vision for the company that they may or may not be interested in, right? Like the playing the investor compared to pitching, telling the story?
Yeah, I think that generally speaking, investors either like the opportunity or they don't like the opportunity, and you're not going to be able to really change them one way or another. So you really don't want to try and get into this uphill battle of like convincing people about something. You generally have these meetings where people kind of take it and it's clear within 5 minutes that this is a complete waste of time. Or you have these meetings where like they totally get it and it's a question of, okay, like how big can this get, and like is this the right team to do it? But if you're in this space where you're like having to like truly educate people, and I'm talking more about like lead investors here, then you're probably going to have a tough time with them in the first place. And I'm curious to hear what Andrew has to say about that, but I actually want to step back for a second about the comment around 2024 and like fundraising dynamics and all of that. I think that people are becoming aware of the amount of challenge associated with fundraising. I wouldn't necessarily say that is like 5x harder. Maybe it's like 2x harder, but it was always really quite hard for most people to raise money from credible investors. And I think that that's like actually a pretty good thing. Like I think that there should be some friction. I think that the worst thing that happens is when people are just given money before they have really considered anything, before they've really evaluated whether or not this is the person that they want to start a company with. There's sort of this like this rush to raise money as like that is the milestone versus like figuring out all of these other things. And you kind of see the emergence of all of these like accelerators and sort of like VC fund like backed accelerators. And the reason that all these exist are because people realize just how hard fundraising is, and they're just like, whereas they might have looked at like one or two accelerators in the past, now they're just looking at sort of like the entire kind of like tray of all of these accelerators and saying like which one could I get into? Like, is that worth just getting into random accelerator X, random accelerator Y, because the terms are like not that much worse than a pre-seed round, and therefore I don't actually have to go through the hassle of like actually doing the hard work of fundraising. I think that investors are taking advantage of this a little bit, of this dynamic, and launching these accelerators. And I think that founders are looking at these as potential options to sort of like short circuit the fundraising game. I think there's a lot of benefits and downsides to this. And I think that it's one of those things where as long as you're making an informed decision, that could be really good. But ultimately, like we're seeing this dynamic where a lot of people are essentially like somewhere between like a pre-seed fund and an accelerator, and how they're sort of like setting a price.
And Julian mentioned it, but Andrew, I did you consider that sort of like, did you look at accelerators compared to pre-seed stuff? Like where did you line up with all of that?
Yeah, I mean, so I think like I agree with pretty much most of what Julian just said. I think on the accelerator front, I think I think there's like a bunch of them now. I think most of them, I think a ton of them are still not worth doing for most, maybe all companies. Like frankly, and including some of like notable names out there. I think they're actually, some of them are flat out negative signal, and I think actually a lot of founders, especially who are like not insiders per se, don't realize that, and they get into some of these things and then they realize it's like actually like not helping them that much when they try to go talk to more notable investors. I think there are a handful that are a little more credible, but I guess like I think some of it's just opportunistic too, is like a lot of just like funds that you didn't even use to invest before the Series A are just pushing down and trying to do deals at earlier and earlier stages. And so there's pros and cons. I mean, you could have a similar conversation about, do you take money at pre-seed from like tier 1, tier 2, like multi-stage fund, which we chose not to. And so I think, to answer your actual question on what we did, I did not. I was like really in this head state of like, I want to have a ton of conviction on what we're doing. And I felt like fundraising just like muddied the waters on that. Like I wasn't even tied to raising venture capital for the company I was starting. It really was more of a matter of like, okay, we legitimately are going to have to raise capital for this. And then I started thinking about when. I did look at one accelerator. And that was only because the founder, it was the mint from BTB. And that was only because like a couple people I really respected said, hey, you should talk to these people because they're like super credible in fintech. And so I looked at that one, but I didn't look at YC, didn't look at any of the others.
I think that the thing that you both kind of bring up, the word like that conviction word, and like building conviction, and the idea of fundraising, it's really hard to look at it this way, right? Because it's such a pain. I think from the founder perspective, as the first time founder, I think later to, second time, third time founders do think about it this way, where it's like an active process that you're deciding to take on, compared to like, oh, I just have to do it because that's what everyone else does. But the act of fundraising as a way to build conviction, or as something that you need to be willing to go through, and that when it's hard, it can save you pain in the future. Like Julian, what you said, right? If you just get money really early, really easy for something that you maybe didn't think that hard about, it can be painful later. But I guess, I don't know, maybe Andrew, maybe you think like,
I just think anything, if you're
right
trying to
amount of
build a company, anything worth doing within it is at some point going to be hard. Like hopefully not all of it, but like there's tons of stuff that it's like, we need this to happen. And there's like a significant amounts of pain and suffering that must be gone through to get to the thing we need to get to. And fundraising is just part of that. Like it's like, I looked at fundraising as like, for us, it's like we literally have to build these things. We need to hire like the best people in the world to have even a shot at doing it correctly, and we need time, and money buys us the resources and time to go do this, or else like we literally cannot start this company. And we think there's the market opportunity to do it, and like it's like, okay, well, I got to go raise money, and so I'm gonna go raise money, and it sucks, and I'm getting told no a lot, but I'm just gonna keep doing it until we like do it, and like that's it. Yeah. It's like no different than like, I need customers, I'm gonna go fly. It's like sales and outbound is hard. It's like, but it's like you do it because you have to do it if you're to accomplish the thing. And so I think to all of this point, it's like, it's not like do I, like, people talk about it in such like nonchalant ways because it's fun, and you get like to talk about it on Twitter and TechCrunch and like whatever. But it's like at the end of the day, ideally, if you have a thing you're building that you have conviction in and you have to raise money for that thing, that is a great reason to go fundraise. And it's like it's like not like we were never asking ourselves like it was never about like, was this fun or not? It was about like, we had to do it, so we did it.
Yeah.
It's you really see very quickly when you talk to founders, like whether or not they think of fundraising as like a fun, like social activity, or like a thing where it's like really cool that I'm talking to these investors, versus like, I'm doing this because this is like core to achieving my goals and my vision of the world that I could build with this company. And I think that, if you haven't done anything with companies before, like it's objectively kind of interesting, I suppose, to be talking to people who've invested in all of these great companies before, right? The fact that they're even meeting with you, like I can totally understand why somebody would be like excited by that. But at the end of the day, if you start to like fall in love with like the process of just like having investor conversations, you're going to have like bad investor conversations. You're going to take meetings prematurely when you shouldn't. I write a lot about this. Like, you should really not be spending a lot of time talking to investors until you're actively fundraising. There's a bunch of nuance to that. Like if you're a multi-time founder, or if you already have like long-standing relationships with people, like that's cool. But like generally speaking, like investor inbound is usually a waste of your time, and also actually like puts you in a bad position, because these folks will then kind of like have that first impression kind of ingrained. And even if you start to make more progress, or your pitch gets better, because you weren't prepared for that first meeting that they inbounded you on, you're kind of like stuck with that initial first impression.
I think you both will have an interesting reaction to this. What do you think of like testing the water type approaches? Right? Like when a founder, and I've heard this before, like, we're thinking about it, we're having some conversations because we want to see, what demand is like out there.
I think I literally was just texting with one of our lead investors about this, and like the term he used for that exact term is cringe, horrible, never say it. And I agree with it, because it's just like, it's like the most low conviction. It's so low conviction. Yeah. And honestly, good investors will see right through it too.
Like maybe we're raising money if like somebody's interested.
If you'll give it to us.
Think about that. That's like,
it's the opposite of what Andrew said, right? Where it's like, you either need the money for specific reasons.
Yeah.
Or you don't, in which case
hell or high water, right? Like, you do it or you don't do it. And like, there's a possibility that you fail to fundraise, or the fundraise is like something that you were hoping was going to be a 2-month process. It ends up being a 6-month process. Like, these things happen. Sometimes they happen because that's just the way life is. Other times they happen because you were unprepared or something like that, or you were doing it prematurely. But at the end of the day, it's like either you're fundraising or you're not fundraising. And like this testing the water thing is frankly crap. I would say the thing though that you could do is you could talk to other founders who've raised and get their feedback about like, hey, like, what do you think about this? Do you think that this is something where if we were to fundraise now, it would put us in a good position? Or do you think that we should be working more on gaining additional traction before we do it? Like, I do think there is value in like getting feedback from your peers, but I think the worst time to do this, or the worst way to do this, is to go and talk to investors and be like, yeah, we're just like, trying to see what people think about this from an investor point of view. I think that that's kind of the addition I would make to that.
The do it or don't do it line, I think is really strong, and I think is this great like header insight, initial kind of rule here. And I think that the thing that Andrew pointed out too, of like, that doesn't mean don't be thoughtful about it. And I think that talking to other founders is a kind of a key way to be thoughtful. But I think one of the nuances on it, and you mentioned kind of like the outbound sales aspect of like, it's not fun, but you have to do it to grow, and it's going to get told no a lot. In fundraising, I think that and this is something that founders, I think that the mentality they've had, where you think of the investor as the customer, and if you're selling something, getting feedback from customers is something like, talk to customers, talk to us. It's like a common startup-y thing. But within the fundraising portion, like where the investor is like the customer, they're going to buy it off you. That doesn't apply, or it's not worth it because it's like it's different. Like, what's the?
I think there's like when you're getting ready to, there's like the do I fundraise or not, and then there's like actually running a process when it's time to fundraise. And so to the last point Julia made, I totally agree. I think with the exception of like there are like founder angel types out there that are technically investors that are great people to talk to, more because like a lot of times they will give you feedback, and it can be helpful. So like I did talk to Julian when we were starting to think about fundraising. But otherwise, yeah, like all of the helpful people that I talked to when fundraising were all other founders. And the ones I talked to the most were ones that were either had mostly just like literally just done it. Like I actually recommend every founder that asks me about fundraising, try to find someone who raised a similar round to you very recently that you trust, and just be on a texting basis with them. It takes some kind of a relationship for that, but just that is so helpful because the questions you're going to have are going to be so tactical that having one or two people like that in your circle is super helpful. But then in terms of like getting investor feedback, or when it's time to raise or whatever, like I think the best thing to do is when you've decided, okay, I'm going to go fundraise and it's going to look like this. It's like there's a bunch of upfront work probably spent also with other founders, maybe some friendly angels that are going to invest no matter what, where you can just get feedback on the pitch. And ideally you're iterating on your materials at this point. And then once you actually hit go, like your first 10 to 15 pitches, in my opinion, are practice. It's like, I mean, maybe if you're really, really good, then maybe it won't work out that way. But that's kind of how we felt about it, is like, hopefully this works. But I specifically only talked to investors that I was kind of okay if they didn't invest. It's like, great, maybe it'll work out if they do. But like, frankly, I was not going after like my preferred people then. And frankly, those pitches, I think they did suck. Like, and I did actually have a couple where I'm like, I actually kind of like that investor, and which that wasn't the impression I left. But we knew what we were raising for, but we were trying to figure out like the story and how that was going to resonate, and like how to tweak this and that. And like, you're going to get questions that you've not maybe thought about as deeply that you need to think about. And I just think that is like part of the process, but that comes after you've decided to raise, and like that is part of your process to raise. At least that's how we thought about it.
The thing I would add to what you just said there is you were like, look, like the first pitches weren't amazing. And imagine how bad they would have been if like an investor had inbounded you 3 months beforehand and you took a random ad hoc meeting. So it would have just been horrible. And like the first meetings are always pretty bad. Unless you've done it before, like a lot. But honestly, even then, like your people are rusty. Like there's a lot of sort of counterintuitive things about having fundraising conversations. Ultimately it's just like you're going to have this process you need to run through where you're kind of like, and I think this is actually an important thing to say, like you should be changing a lot of the way you describe your business, the materials that you're presenting. You should be changing these like pretty significantly multiple times throughout, like even the day. But at least out throughout like the 24-hour, 48-hour cycles, like there are going to be a lot of things you're learning where you're like, oh man, I just had 3 calls back to back, and 2 out of 3, like they didn't understand anything about this one point I was trying to make. Like I really need to change that. So there's like this continual learning and iteration process where I think it's less about telling people what they want to hear, because I think that was what you had sort of brought up, Adam, earlier.
Yeah.
It's more about telling people what they can understand, right?
Articulating.
Oftentimes it's like, it's usually really hard to understand what somebody's saying, like pretty frequently. Like, I talk to a lot of founders who are really, really early on in their idea. And when they'll say what they're trying to build, this is like way before fundraising, because I'm not talking to them in the context of fundraising. It will be really hard to actually understand what they're trying to build because they haven't really gotten to a place where they can fully articulate that in a clear way. And that a lot of that still exists, and those problems still exist when it comes to storytelling around fundraising. So there's like, this is a thing you develop over time. It's not something that comes out fully formed and perfect.
Yeah, I think that I've had this lesson, and people just talked about with content more generally, and Andrew and I might have even texted about this, where reps are really like writing. How do you get better at writing? You write a lot. How do you get better at doing interviews? You do a lot of interviews. Like, and I think that the interesting part about fundraising, right? Like you get better at the pitching from giving the pitch, but the key distinction point that you both mentioned, right? Of there's the kind of internal process. And then when you think that it gets over the hump enough to press go on the process, and that doesn't mean it's done, but then there's continued refinement that happens through it where you're going to learn things, be ready to learn them and to implement them.
Now, imagine you did, if we're talking about reps, imagine you did reps like you were studying a foreign language, right? And you studied it once every month. You did a 30-minute session. Probably not a good way to learn a foreign language, right? Probably also not a good way to fundraise. And there are a lot of people who do these sort of ad hoc meetings, as we were talking about earlier, or who sort of like space out their investor conversations or don't do a sufficient number of investor conversations. I think, Andrew, you said that you spoke to 100 or 200 investors, and maybe we can actually talk about that now. But like there are so many reps that are needed to have a successful fundraise, even if you're like Andrew and you're an exceptional founder and you've got a really great business with like a clear market need and a big opportunity. There's just so many reps that are going to be necessary because by the nature of seed or pre-seed, most people are not going to believe that this is a valuable company or a good idea, because if they did, then it would be $100 million company, right? Like that's how it works.
Yeah. No, that's funny. And so I think, did you have something, Andrew? Was there something for you to respond to there? I got thinking about the timeline stuff.
Yeah, like the 100, like talk a little bit about sort of like what that was like.
Yeah, I think so. I think generally, I definitely did this earlier in my career, just getting into startups. Really underrating like how many investors you should be talking to. I will meet like founders that I think are pretty strong and talented, and they're I don't know, they're talking to like, they think they're running a process and they've got like 3 investor meetings in their calendar, or they're like getting strung along by these like 2 VCs, and it's like, and then you ask why, and it's like or they're doing the thing where they're kind of talking to investors, but they're also kind of doing other stuff and they're not focused on it. And like when we were fundraising, like by the peak of it, the screenshot I had on like Twitter or LinkedIn or whatever was like there was like day stretches where I would talk to like 15 investors in a single day. I was just like, it was all I would do. Like when I was fundraising, it was like the majority of what I would do every single day. And especially at like peak of process when we were just going hard and trying to get a round done, like we were talking to a ton of people. And so like literally like what we did is we spent, there was a bunch of time with Friendlies working on the pitch, working on our materials. And then once we kind of had the materials down, I started taking meetings, but I wasn't going super hard yet. This was like the 10 to 15 practice type pitches thing, right? And then I'd add technically, it was probably more like 30, because I had like a bunch of friendly conversations with people that were like angels that were probably going to invest either way, but like I could get good feedback from it. And then we started going harder, and I think we talked to like 120 people over, a little bit north of that. in total by the time it was done over like a 5-ish week period. And I'd say that does not include like the friendlies. And so like that's a lot of people to talk to in a pretty short period of time. Um, so I just think like people don't realize like how important it is to do that, because like one, also two, you are kind of trying to find people that like share your belief about the world. Like nowadays, like every investor says they do pre-seed seed, but like you don't really know. Like saying like an investor saying I invested pre-seed could literally mean like we invest in second time exited founders when they start a new company, which is like technically pre-seed. And it's like, okay, cool, but that's like otherwise all of your deals are like companies that have like XYZ traction. And some of that you're only going to find out by literally talking to people. So to some extent you have to do volume for that. You have to do volume to figure out who you like, because some people, like, you're going to talk to them and just be like, okay, I resonate with this person, but I really didn't like that person. So there's a little bit of that that's like beneficial to you. And some of it's just like you got to find people. You're getting better at the pitch, but you're also trying to find people that like see the world the same way you do, that are going to get like excited about like the thing that you're pitching them on. And like I would be surprised about that sometimes. Like people that I never would have thought would get excited about tax compliance. And then there were people that you would think like should be like domain experts and really know the space, but they knew it too well, and they were just like, I don't think anybody's going to build a good company here. And so like to some extent, like you're like learning more about the market as you go through it. And then I think the final thing is like it is in your best interest to talk to as many people as possible once you are running a process, because then the options may not work out this way, but ideally the options are going to be yours if things work. And so if like things like most of fundraising is just like you're getting told no, you're getting told no, you're getting told no, and it's like it all kind of sucks. And then all of a sudden you're like, this was our experience and it cannot go this way. But like if you're somewhat successful and you hit a point where like you're the demand has surpassed the supply of capital that you're raising, so you're oversubscribed, all of the leverage is yours at that point. And so, and like things totally shift in your favor. And so if you are in a spot where like you want to work with, like you want to pick the best people you possibly can to work with, you're going to have leverage there. And you're going to get to hopefully choose. But if you only talked to like, even if you got around them, if you only talked to like 20 people, some of the best investors out there possible for you didn't even talk to. So I just think like there's, and last thing too, I think on like this, I wrote something down in our doc prepping of confidence versus conviction. And I just think like, I think having the more conversations you have, the more confident you can be, because when some like investor is being a jerk or is wasting your time, I like literally like we were so busy at one point, like I could not give I won't curse on here, but I literally didn't have time to care. It's like I got like 8 more people to talk to. And for me personally, at least, like I'm really bad at playing the game. I don't play the game. Like I hate playing the game. I'm not good at the gamesmanship of fundraising. And so when I would say we're like having a lot of conversations and trying to get around done, like people believe me. When I said we were oversubscribed and we were like making decisions on who we were going to take money from, people believe me because like we were literally talking to tons of people. And so I think like everything is just it's better for your mindset, it's better for your odds of getting around done, and it's better for your odds of finding good people.
Yeah. There is like another thing I would add to that, and I actually have a question for Andrew. But let me just respond to what he was saying, and then I'll ask my question because I think it's a good potential like next topic. I think the first thing is like you shouldn't try and game fundraising. Just like every clever idea that you have, every investor has seen like a dozen times. So good luck with that, right? It just doesn't work. Like I've seen it with ODF. I've seen so many people try and game fundraising and it just really doesn't work. The way you game fundraising is by having a very clear narrative, a compelling team, a great market, and good traction, right? Like even then it's really hard. The other thing I'll say is that, if you actually do the math on what Andrew said, he said like about 125 meetings, 5 weeks. Well, there's 5 business days because a lot of investors will only meet on business days. They don't believe in working on the weekend, even though they expect their founders to. I'm joking somewhat. I know a lot of investors who do work on the weekend. But anyways, like just divide it by 5. You have 5 meetings a day, and Andrews, and that's like probably the minimum that you want on average. And obviously there's probably like a sort of like a peak there where you probably were having more than 5 meetings a day, and probably at the beginning and at the end you were having less. But if you were to actually average it out, it's 5 meetings a day. the thing that's really important to note there is like that's a lot of meetings. And at the same time, yes, it's like demanding, and there's a lot of like follow up and like, you know, email coordination and things like that. But it is still like a thing where you can make progress with your business at the same time. And I highly encourage you making progress with your business while fundraising and not taking your foot off the gas on like trying to make some form of progress with the business. Because usually if you can do that, it allows you to like report back like actual substantive business progress. And that's something that can help folks. Andrew, I was super curious. You know, you went out and you fundraised, so you talked to a lot of folks. What were the folks in terms of geo? Like, how many people were you talking to who were New York based because you're in New York? How many people were you talking to who are outside of it? Like, what did you end up going with in terms of geography? Because I think that maybe people have like a perception around sort of like who you can talk to or how you can talk to people, depending on where you're based.
I did not think about it based on where people were based at. It was like a non-factor. The majority of the calls were almost even including most of the people that invested. I didn't meet them in person until after the investment was done, and so the majority of the people we never met in person at all during the process. And a handful of folks that we did pitch in person because they were either based in New York or like we were in diligence with some people. They happened to be in New York during that process, and so we got coffee or something. But of everything, it was like 95% of the meetings plus were digital, so Zoom, and then. Yeah, like it was like a non-factor. Our investors, like our lead investors, technically two of the are based in Boston, but like their GPs are distributed. A couple of our investors or two or three of the funds that invested are all based in San Francisco. There's some folks in New York. It's all over the place. And I think the point Julian's trying to pull out here is that these days, especially at early stage, like you can it doesn't matter as much as you might think where you're based. It's certainly where you're based is going to more influence what your personal network is.
Yep.
But in terms of like running the process, like I could have been fundraising in Ohio and it wouldn't have like changed that much.
Where you're based is somewhat of a proxy for your network, and also for the work that you might have done in the past. Because traditionally companies were in-person companies. So a lot of the work that you did, and the credible company that you might have worked for, was something that was usually in like a major tech hub. But, you know, generally speaking, outside of like the personal network that you already had before fundraising, it doesn't really matter where you're fundraising from. Geographically, it's very interesting to see how many meetings are done virtually now. And so it doesn't really matter. Like Andrew could have been anywhere outside of the fact that, you know, he was he already had a network and it was established in New York, but like the meetings could take place virtually, and they often do.
And I feel like I remember the time not so long ago where that was kind of crazy. I will never forget either the TechCrunch or the information article about like Sequoia writing, 5 checks over Zoom, and that being like a headline, or like they did it. And that tilts pipe, because doing 5 meetings a day in person, that sounds hard logistically hard, like even in New York. Right. But one of the questions that I wanted to ask, which actually kind of rewinds a little bit, where we talk about like, okay, maybe 125 meetings. Mm-hmm. How do you think about building pipeline there? How many of those meetings, like how many targets did you have before pressing go compared to adding after, right? Because I think a big thing for founders, and I'm listening to this from like, someone who's thinking about raising, I'm hearing like, okay, great. I need to like make the decision once I make the decision, I need to have these many meetings. And the common founders, like, I don't know 125 investors. Like, how do I, much less the ones that will get on the phone with me. Like, how do I, and I think it's a hurdle that can be, I think it's accomplishable just through just sheer effort. But like, I'm wondering, Andrew and Julian, where does that effort go? Do you think most effectively? Like, is it, scraping stuff?
Yeah.
Is it asking people? Like, I don't know. There's a bunch of different.
Yeah. I think there's like, I got asked about this a lot because I made a couple of posts on social media about my experience with it. And like, so I'll get into the actual, like how I would approach this depending on where I was coming from. But I did not go to, like, literally no one has heard of my school. My school is so bad that an angel investor I met literally told me you should take like, and he said this, he was actually very kind and like helpful. Like he wasn't a hater. He literally said, I think your story is incredible, but I think you should take the school you went off to after your LinkedIn profile because it doesn't help you. And I did. It's not on my, it's not there. And so like the school I went to, not going to help. My parents never went to college. My parents are not in tech. My parents don't know investors. That wasn't going to get me anywhere. And so like realistically, and this was true with like my starting off point. So I I literally sat down one day and just realized how much the odds were stacked against me, knowing my career goals. Like this is probably 4 years ago, maybe a little bit more. And was like, I'm gonna work really, really hard and put myself in the position to where like that's not that way in like 3 to 5 years or whatever it ends up being. And so one of the reasons I joined OnDeck back in the day was like, this is gonna get me into a better set of networks around really like talented people and hopefully I can prove myself and then just like work really hard and like I think good things will happen of that whether or not like to whatever degree that OnDeck succeeds and that proved out and like everything with my network and what reputation I do have expanded out from like work that partially started there and so I think like the real answer is like I worked for years at it hoping to get to the point where I could get introductions to credible investors and so the answer is like I didn't send a single cold email for fundraising purposes while we were fundraising. Everything was a warm introduction or someone I already knew. But like there was like years leading up to being able to do that. I could not have done that 5 years ago for sure. And so I think your options are you do that. And I think that does work, but it's like you can't
which is
just
an
do it
option.
overnight.
Which is an option. Yeah, it
Yeah.
just takes a long time. Yeah, it just takes
Yeah, it's just going to take a long time. And so I think like if you don't have that option, you're like building a company and you're high conviction on it, and you're like, I like don't have that choice. I think your next best option is join something like YC or OnDeck, where if you it can be a bit of a shortcut to where like you get in and they do those groups both like will take bets on outsiders. And so like if you are able to get in, it can change the paradigm and you can actually jumpstart building that network a little bit. That's a good option. Or just like I've seen people figure out a way like they themselves are still compelling and what they're doing is compelling and they find a way to just like they figure out a story that's compelling and then it's harder for them. But all those people need if you and your thing is compelling, even if you're don't have the traditional resume, I think your third option outside of those like first two things is like you just find one or two early believers who are super connectors themselves. Like Julian has done this for people before, and like all it takes is one of those people, and then you kind of bootstrap off their credibility. They start making introductions, and then people take you seriously. I think the cold email thing is it can work, and maybe that's how you get in front of one of those super connectors. But I think that I would only be applying that strategy to the extent that like helps you find some kind of like super connector or person that's going to like open up doors for you.
Yeah,
I guess you could argue
interesting.
last thing you could argue
Yep.
social media has been this for some people where they like almost like tweeted themselves into like being able to raise the kind of money and like do the kind of things they want to do. Like I've seen some people take that strategy as well.
I'll add a couple others. And it depends on sort of your age and sort of where you are in life. I think that one thing is that you could actually become a magnet for talent. And once you're a magnet for talent, you could actually become a person who helps, who builds relationships with investors. Like, again, this is sort of like a thing that's like very far in advance of actually building a company, but this could work really well. I actually wrote an essay about how to become a magnet or to build magnets for college students. I just sent a link to that. The other thing is I really think that it's like skipping straight to founding a company is like fine. Like it's not like a horrible decision, but I think it's like super underrated to like actually go spend time at early stage startups and just like learn voraciously. You build a network, you find potential co-founders. I mean, we didn't talk about this, but like Andrew met his co-founder Steven because they work together at OnDeck. And like that happens all the time, right? Where people find their co-founders through something like that, or they find their co-founders through ODF, right? There's really something to be said about like getting yourself into a place where one, you can learn about how things work, like at a startup. You can, if you haven't experienced that before, you can find potential collaborators. usually like you find some of your first investors from the place that you worked at too, right? Like if somebody had a good experience working with you, like they're going to want to invest in you in your company. They're going to want to make introductions to investors for you, right? So like there's all of these benefits to that. And then also you have like a track record of building something. So there's a lot of benefit to it, and I highly recommend it. The other thing is like, can you plug into a network, as Andrew was saying, like YC, ODF, right? Like ODF is not an accelerator. It's for people who are exploring starting companies. So it's like, again, kind of like, if you don't have a co-founder yet, it's a good thing to join. And there's also, I think another thing that we didn't talk about, but I think is actually like pretty viable for a lot of people is non-dilutive grants. Not government grants usually, because those take a really long time, but there are grants like 1517 gives out usually to younger people who just need a small amount of money to be able to make progress on an idea because they have some costs associated with the idea. Emergent Ventures, Tyler Cowen's initiative. I just spoke to a person yesterday who got a 10K grant just so they could literally continue to work on their idea. And it's non-dilutive grant. It's literally just because, there are people out there who want to see ambitious, creative, usually younger people in the case of these grants, go out there and pursue their interests, which if they have any sort of progress in them could actually be really meaningful for the world. So I wouldn't discount these like micro grants as a way of like potentially getting a little bit of funding, which also can lend credibility, right? If you say, hey, like I received an Emergent Ventures grant, like, is that the same as saying that Sequoia led your seed round? Well, you haven't raised a seed round yet, but it definitely is like a vote of confidence in you and what you've done.
Yeah. I think one of the, just to kind of regurgitate some of the really interesting points that from both of you, that idea of networking finding a way into a network if you're outside of the network, rather than thinking, because I think the common advice that gets put out, although you just have to, just grind it out, you have to take more meetings, and you probably will have to take more meetings, right? If you are out of network or you haven't done it before or whatever. But the idea of spending your time networking into a super connector rather than, or finding your way into a super connector, YC is an example, meeting like ODF's example, just meeting someone maybe like Julian or like Andrew, who, if you can, that are in network, and if you can convince that one person to be a node for you, that's the way to multiply. Yeah. There's a really interesting take that I haven't heard before compared to, again, compared to, oh, you're just going to have to talk to a lot more people. And I think that, and it gets to be actually to an interesting, I think, another point as we get towards the end here of when do you think you've gone far enough? Like you've tried hard enough? Like when is the moment where, because there's the great part of the story, right? Where you do it all the right way, you build a pipeline, or you find your way into the network, you have 125 conversations, you go from lots of no's to a few yeses to too many yeses, you take all the right people, you close up. The tougher, then there's like that's like the bull case, there's like the medium case, the bear case. The medium case, or the base case, maybe it drags out for longer, right? And then there's the other case where it doesn't work out. And when, in your all's experience dealing with other founders, maybe is a time to consider the no's as the right, like maybe I'm not thinking about this the right way, or is there just no, right? Because I think as a founder, you have to put on this face of, I don't care about the no's. And then after maybe, I don't know, you've been doing it for 6 months and all you've got is no's, maybe you should think about what's going on more, or maybe think about the conviction you have. Like what, and that's a really hard question, but have you all had conversations with friends ever about this, or seen people that they get to the point where it's like, maybe you should think about what you're building rather than the way you're telling the story and stuff like that?
I think so much of this is just like, it's even most of what we've talked about with like what works in fundraising is like all stuff that is like almost like pre the fundraise itself.
Yeah.
Like, I think if you as a person / your idea / like what you're building, whatever, is like backable, I actually think like it's much more important to focus on getting to a point where like you and what you're doing is backable than it is on like all the fundraising stuff. Cause like all the process stuff is like actually like so much, it's like 20% of it. It's like, it's execution, and it's very easy to execute. on, like, when I meet a founder who's like clearly incredible and they're doing a thing, it's so easy to help them because it's just like the execution details are like not that hard because the substance is there. And
Mhm.
so usually when like something, and I think this is true for early stage, I think like later stage rounds, I won't pretend that I'm an expert on. And so I think, but if you're talking like pre-seed seed type fundraising, if you've sometimes it is just going to be tough. Like I had friends that just had to grind it out for 6 months and they eventually got around done. But if you've gone forever and like and you it's just like not working, there probably is something there. And I would hope you have someone around you that will be honest with you about like why the market is not receptive. And it could just be the market is just like the timing is this bad or your market is this out of favor. But sometimes it could just be like the idea is just like not very good or your something about your team is really, really uncompelling. Like maybe there's a huge piece of the team that's missing, but there's probably something in that. And I think a lot of times people just aren't being honest with you about like what that is. And so ideally find someone that'll be honest with you and then be honest with yourself.
Yeah,
Yeah.
anybody usually if people give reasons for passing, they're not the right reasons because usually the reason they're passing is because of you. Which is
Yeah.
really hard to hear.
Yeah.
And it, I should say even harder to say to like give some sort of empathy.
Which is why it doesn't get said, right? Because it's
yeah, like nobody's gonna say sorry.
You're not the guy.
Like
I
don't believe in you. But like that's effectively what people are saying. Like to some degree, if the market is very clear, like that's often what it means, unfortunately. And look, I think that oftentimes the reason that fundraisers don't work is usually some form of like self-sabotage, often not intentional, of course, because nobody wants to sabotage themselves. But like, recently there's a founder that I just absolutely love, and he's been making progress on his fundraise. And he just had like the worst time with lead investors. And there was this lead investor who essentially was like, they're the only person who he could get. And they were like, yeah, we'll invest if you get like X 100K or X million in commitments outside of us. Right. But like, you have to like line up those angels and those smaller funds first. And it's like, okay, like whatever, like that sucks. And like, that's annoying, but like, it seemed like they would do it. Maybe like I think that these conditional commitments are usually bullshit and you shouldn't trust them. But it's like, okay, well, we're going to keep trying to get commitments from these other investors anyways. Like we want to raise money. And of course, like when they actually got to the point where they had all of these commitments, like the investor had, a bunch of reasons why these weren't actual commitments or like whatever. It didn't pass muster. And it was like, oh, like, fuck, like we actually have this position where we had all these investors lined up and now the lead isn't going to commit. And it was like, well, have we just tried asking the people who were committing like to sign and wire safes, sign safes and wire now? And they were like, you know what, like we should just ask them like to sign. And like they hadn't like necessarily thought that they could do that and that people would be amenable to that. They kind of always framed it to people as like, yeah, we're raising this amount of money, but they hit all of those people up after like this bullshit that they had to deal with from that lead investor or prospective lead investor. And like every single person was like, of course I'll sign and wire. Like I'm super excited. Like they didn't need a lead investor. So I think that like sometimes it's just like stuff like this where it's just kind of like, you're kind of like, oh wow, like I need this thing. And actually maybe you don't need this thing in the case of like a lead investor. And then also just stuff like, if you've been at it for 6 months, like I hope you've been making like traction with your business, right? Because if you're making actual traction and momentum with the business, like you're going to have like increased interest from some investors. Some investors will just never be interested no matter what. You could be, a Series B stage and they'll still be writing you off, right? But like some investors will be like, okay, like this is interesting, but I'm kind of like curious what's going to happen. And I've seen so many times where the investor ends up coming in after seeing, a month or two worth of progress, because there's that whole like concept of like some investors really want to see like lines, not dots, right? They want to see like progress over time. And you can actually show them that progress over time if you're raising over 2.5 months and you're actually making business progress in parallel.
Yeah, it's I think the thing that comes to mind too in all of this, and like I talked about timelines a little bit, 2.5 months raise, and the shortest raise everyone hears of, right? It's like the third time founder, multiple exits, they raised in a week. And that's because, and it's similar, it reminds me of Andrew's story a little bit, where it didn't happen it happened in 5 weeks for Andrew, because you put years of work in beforehand that allowed for it to execute on that timeline. And I think that that's a really interesting and important lesson of like the prep, whether it's, over the course of years or, decades for some founders, right, who have been at it for, multiple exits and stuff like that. Or if it's your first time and you're out of network, just thinking about that time that you spend before you start as really like you're really getting into whether or not it's going to go well, rather than, it being all about, the execution phase or, the calls and stuff like that.
Yeah.
As an ender, I know we're at time here. And
can I actually just say one quick thing on that? Because I feel like Andrew kind of like almost to an extent, like you undersell just the amount of like incredible work and things that you've done in advance of fundraising and having, this great sort of early traction with TaxWire. It reminds me of that perhaps like apocryphal thing about Picasso and how some lady asked him to like make a drawing on a napkin at a restaurant. He did it in like 15 seconds and he told her it would cost, he's like, that'll be thousands of dollars. Like, you have to pay me now for it. And she was like, it only took you 10 seconds. He's like, no, it took me my entire life. It's like that pre-work, like all of those things go towards like having like a more successful fundraising outcome. Like from 5 weeks, like, Andrew, if you hadn't done all this stuff, it could have taken months, right? In advance. So like, I do think there's like all of that pre-work, and I don't think people should necessarily look at it as a chore. Well, hopefully you didn't think like us working together was a chore. Like hopefully it was actually fun and beneficial and all that.
Yeah, no, working with Julian was a blast. And no, it's like, I think all of it to Julian's point, like adds up and is part of it. Like, I certainly didn't know I'd be starting TaxWire when I joined OnDeck. And so it's like, I'm not here without that piece of my story, that chapter. And so, and I think the last quick thing I will say, even with like our relatively successful case scenario, like we got told no more than we got told yes. And it was hard. I was really stressed out. I at one point told my co-founder, Stephen, the market feels so tough right now. We may still be raising in January. And we were coming up to the holidays. So we had a lot of stress to try to get it done before the holidays. And I was like, we need to be prepared for the scenario where this like really doesn't go our way. And so I like, there was a moment where like, I really didn't think we're going to get it done. And there was like and it was actually a 2-month process if I include how much time we spent getting our materials and story prepped before we even started fundraising. So like, just every single thing that you like, most of these things, everything we've talked about today has been really simple. Actually, it's just like people underrate the sheer amount of like just time and effort that goes into anything you're probably relatively proud of on the other side of it. So
well, we could keep going. I'm going to cut it there because I think it's a nice note to end on, and I really appreciate both of you coming on. I've got a little, I'll put this up for everybody, and because I know you both have ways for people to get connected with you or to go to these are the websites for both of the things that Julian and that Julian sorry, and Andrew are leading. Super excited to get this out. We'll cut this up. We'll distribute the recording for people who weren't able to make it live today, and we'll put it out. So thank you to both of you again. I think super valuable for everyone who was able to show up and people who will watch the recording. So thanks again, and I'm sure we'll be in touch at some point soon.
Cool. Thanks, man. Thanks for having us.
Cheers. Thanks for having us.
Thanks, guys.
Cheers.